The sun hung low over the sprawling Georgia coastline, casting long shadows across the river's edge, where the Darnell plantation sprawled like a fortress of suffering. From the shore, the Atlantic whispered a song of freedom that the masters could never hear, a rhythm that stirred in the hearts of those brought in chains from faraway lands. To the white overseers and plantation owners, the estate was the very image of prosperity: orderly fields, polished porches, and laboring bodies under the relentless southern Sunday. Yet beneath the surface of forced obedience, a quiet, unyielding rebellion brewed. Among the newest arrivals were men and women ripped from the Igbo homeland, brought across oceans to serve strangers and endure unthinkable cruelty. They had known freedom, dignity, and the songs of their ancestors. And now, in this foreign land, they faced chains, whips, and attempts to erase their very identities. Yet in their hearts, a fire burned, a fire that no lash, no command, no master could extinguish. This is the story of Chike and the Igbo slaves, who chose to embrace that fire fully, who refused to submit to cruelty, and who made a choice that would echo through history. It is a story of courage, defiance, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to be enslaved in body or soul. Before we step into this chapter of sacrifice and resolve, tell me, where are you watching from? What time is it? Can you imagine standing at the edge of the river, witnessing the ultimate act of defiance? Drop a comment below, and if stories of courage and rebellion draw you in, hit subscribe, because what you are about to hear has been hidden in whispered tales and forbidden legends for centuries. The ships had arrived at the plantation before dawn, their hulls groaning under the weight of human lives bound in chains. The Igbo men and women, disoriented and terrified, were dragged onto the docks, the salty sea air mingling with the stench of sweat, fear, and unwashed bodies. Chike, young but strong, kept his head high, though his wrists and ankles bore the cruel marks of the journey. Around him, others trembled, their eyes wide with disbelief and sorrow. The overseers barked orders, herding the newly arrived like cattle. Each step forward was a battle against exhaustion, pain, and despair. The plantation itself loomed ahead, its whitewashed mansion gleaming against the river, overseers patrolling with rigid authority, and fields stretching endlessly into the distance. This was to be their new world, one of toil, submission, and brutality. Chike's eyes darted to the faces of his companions, men and women who had crossed oceans, bound by chains yet united by memory and culture. They whispered in their native tongue, sharing songs and prayers from their homeland, small acts of defiance that reminded them of the freedom they had been denied. The overseers scowled at the murmurs, but the words were hidden from understanding a secret current of hope running through despair. The master of the estate, Mr. Thompson, stood on the porch, observing the arrival with a mixture of pride and arrogance. To him, these people were property, tools for profit, objects to shape, break, and command. The whips and chains were his instruments, and he wielded them with ruthless precision. The fear in the eyes of the Igbo slaves pleased him, a confirmation of his dominion. Yet Chike and the others had already begun to resist silently. A footstep missed here, a glance defiant there, a song whispered in the dead of night. Each small act was a seed of rebellion, a reminder that they were more than mere property. They had survived oceans, storms, and strangers' cruelty. They would survive this too. That night, as the enslaved gathered in the quarters, exhaustion pressing against their bones, Chike spoke quietly to a small circle. "We have come far, and they may try to break us," he said, his voice low but steady. "But we carry our freedom within, even if they cannot see it. We must remember who we are, where we come from. Our spirits are not theirs to take." The words resonated among the group, a fragile but powerful light in the darkness of oppression. They had endured the ocean's cruelty, the chains of the voyage, and the brutality of the master. But in that moment, they understood one truth. Their bodies might be bound, but their minds and spirits remained free. As the first stars appeared over the river, the Igbo slaves huddled together, singing the songs of their ancestors, whispering the prayers of their homeland, and holding on to the memory of freedom. The plantation slept under the quiet control of the master, unaware that in the hearts of those he thought broken, A fire was burning, a fire that would soon demand to be heard. The plantation days stretched endlessly, each one a test of endurance, obedience, and the fragile will to survive. Chike and the other Igbo slaves labored under the hot Georgian sun, their hands blistered from the cotton fields, and their backs stiff from long hours of toil. Yet within this relentless rhythm of forced labor, they found ways to resist quietly, to preserve fragments of the life that had been stolen from them. At night, when the overseer's lanterns dimmed and the master retired to the mansion, Chike gathered a small group in the shadowed corners of the quarters. There, beneath the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the rough-hewn windows, they shared the songs of their homeland, their voices soft but insistent, weaving together memory and defiance. The melodies carried stories of freedom, ancestors, and lands untouched by chains, reminders that they were more than property. Essie, a young woman whose hands moved deftly in weaving and mending, taught others the intricate patterns of the Igbo dance. Each movement, each footfall, was a declaration of identity, a silent protest against the plantation's imposed order. Children huddled nearby, learning the rhythms and stories, absorbing the culture that the master and overseers sought to erase. But the master, Mr. Thompson, was no fool. He noticed small things: a foot tapping out of sync, a quiet hum of a song, a glance held too long among the workers. He grew frustrated at what he perceived as insolence, interpreting these acts as disrespect rather than survival. He punished the slightest perceived defiance with lashes or deprivation, trying to instill fear that would break both body and spirit. Yet Chike and his companions were careful. Every act of cultural preservation was subtle, hidden within the tasks of daily labor, coded in gestures that the overseers could not interpret. A secret nod here, a whispered phrase there, a song masked as humming while working the fields. They became masters of concealment, turning the plantation's order against itself. Chike emerged as a quiet leader among them, his presence commanding respect without force. His intelligence and poise inspired the others, giving them courage to endure and to resist in ways that were invisible yet potent. He reminded them of their roots, their strength, and the fire that still lived in their veins. "Remember who we are," he said softly one evening, "and the chains they place on us cannot bind our spirits. They can control our bodies, but not our minds, not our hearts." The other enslaved workers whispered their agreement, their eyes reflecting both fear and defiance. Even under threat of punishment, the cultural rituals provided a tether to freedom, a reminder that oppression could not erase identity. The shared stories, songs, and dances were acts of rebellion, small but persistent, slowly cultivating a quiet strength among the Igbo people. Meanwhile, the master's irritation grew. His inability to fully suppress their spirits only deepened his cruelty, creating a vicious cycle. The more he tried to dominate, the more subtle and insistent their resistance became. Every evening, as Chike led the group in quiet ceremonies of remembrance and defiance, the shadow of retribution loomed, but so did the affirmation that their spirit could not be broken. By the time the moon hung high over the plantation, the Igbo slaves had strengthened both their resolve and their bond. They were no longer merely victims of circumstance. They were keepers of a legacy, custodians of a culture that refused to die, even in chains. And in the heart of Chike, a plan was beginning to take shape, one that would transform their quiet acts of resistance into a bold, irrevocable stand for freedom. The relentless days on the Darnell plantation had honed both body and mind. Chike moved among the enslaved workers with a quiet authority, observing patterns, gauging reactions, and listening to whispers of fear and hope alike. Each lash, each shouted command, each subtle insult from the overseers added fuel to a fire that burned deep within him. He had endured enough. He had witnessed too much cruelty. Now, he knew the time would come to act not in secret, not in shadows, but in a way that could not be ignored. The enslaved gathered in hidden corners, beneath the thick canopy of trees or in the dark recesses of the quarters. There, away from prying eyes, Chike spoke in hushed tones. His voice, calm but firm, carried the weight of years of suffering. "We have survived the chains, the lashes, and the insults," he said. But survival alone is not enough. They seek to strip us of our dignity, our culture, our very selves. We must choose, submit, or rise in a way they will never forget. His words were met with a mixture of fear, awe, and resolve. For some, the idea of rebellion was terrifying. The cost of resistance could be immediate death. Yet Chike reminded them of their ancestors, of the courage that had carried them across oceans, and of the spirits that could not be enslaved. "We can die as free people or live as property," he said, his eyes scanning each face, letting the gravity of choice sink in. "We will decide our own fate." The plan they formed was simple in concept, yet profound in its impact. The Igbo slaves would refuse to continue laboring for the plantation. They would reclaim their bodies, their dignity, and their agency in one collective act. The river, always a looming presence at the edge of the plantation, became central to the plan. Its waters offered both escape and a final declaration of autonomy, a refusal to serve under oppression any longer. Chike emphasized unity. "Alone, we are powerless," he said. "Together, we are a force they cannot control. Every step we take, every action we choose, we take as one. Our strength is in our bond, our courage, and our refusal to be diminished." The enslaved workers practiced in secret, walking the riverbanks at night, observing the currents, memorizing paths, and rehearsing the collective act of defiance. The water, glinting under moonlight, became a symbol of both danger and liberation. It demanded courage to enter, yet promised freedom from chains, both physical and spiritual. As the overseers increased their surveillance, suspecting subtle resistance among the workers, Chike and his companions became even more cautious. Each whispered conversation, each clandestine movement, was carefully orchestrated to avoid detection. The tension on the plantation grew almost palpable, a silent countdown to an inevitable confrontation. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the Igbo slaves had cemented their pact. Fear and hope intertwined, forming a bond stronger than any chain or lash. They understood the stakes. The act they were planning would be irreversible. It would not be without danger, and many would not survive, but it would also be their ultimate statement. Their bodies, their spirits, and their honor would remain intact. That night, as the wind rustled through the tall grasses and the river whispered in the distance, Chike felt a quiet certainty settle over him. The time for waiting was over. The time for action had come. Together, the Igbo slaves would walk into the water and reclaim the freedom that had been denied to them since birth, leaving behind a legacy that would haunt the Darnell plantation forever. The sun had barely risen when the Igbo slaves assembled at the edge of the river, its waters gleaming silver under the early light. The plantation behind them was alive with the usual sounds of labor, the cracking of whips, the barked orders of overseers, the shuffle of feet through the cotton fields. But today, the rhythm of the estate was about to be broken, and the calm precision of the morning masked the storm that was about to erupt. Chike stood at the forefront, his eyes scanning the horizon, taking in the expanse of water and the fields beyond. Beside him, his companions, men and women who had endured the ocean crossing, the chains, and years of brutal oppression gathered silently. Their faces were a mix of fear, resolve, and a quiet dignity that the master could never strip from them. Each had made the same decision. They would not serve, they would not be diminished, and they would reclaim their freedom, even if it cost their lives. The overseers, initially oblivious, began noticing the unusual gathering. "What are they doing?" one barked, stepping closer to the riverbank. The men hesitated, sensing that something unprecedented was unfolding, something that defied the plantation's rigid hierarchy. Chike raised his hand, signaling unity. "Together," he whispered in Igbo, the words carried in the rhythm of their shared language. One by one, they stepped into the river. The cold water lapped at their legs, chilling but invigorating, a physical reminder of the freedom that awaited beyond obedience. The overseers shouted, attempting to intervene. But the slaves moved with purpose and coordination, their bodies flowing as one into the river. Panic rippled through the plantation as the magnitude of the act became clear. These were not isolated escapes, they were a collective refusal, a demonstration of control reclaimed. The master, Mr. Thompson, emerged from the mansion, a look of disbelief frozen on his face. He watched helplessly as the slaves, his property, his source of labor and wealth, walked willingly into the water rather than submit. The audacity of their defiance stunned him, and for a moment he could not command, could not punish, could not reclaim what he had long taken for granted. The water, swift and deep, became both shield and testament. Those who entered held their heads high, the memory of their homeland and the strength of their ancestors guiding them forward. To the overseers and onlookers, it was incomprehensible. The very lives they sought to dominate had chosen death and uncertainty over a lifetime of subjugation. Among the onlookers, a few enslaved workers who had not joined the act felt the tremor of courage and shame. Some cried silently, others whispered prayers, but all were marked by the spectacle of defiance. Chike's leadership, his resolve, and the unity of the Igbo slaves left an indelible impression, an unforgettable lesson in the price of freedom and the power of collective action. By the time the sun had fully risen, the river held the bodies of those who refused to be enslaved, moving with the current toward an uncertain horizon. The plantation, once a theater of fear and obedience, now stood silent and shattered in its perceived authority. Whispers of the event would ripple through the estate and the neighboring lands, becoming legend, a cautionary tale for masters and a beacon of hope for the oppressed. That day, the Igbo slaves had not merely walked into the water, they had stepped into history, reclaiming their dignity, their autonomy, and their place in the hearts of those who would hear their story for generations to come. The Darnell plantation was silent that morning, but the stillness was heavy, suffused with shock and disbelief. Overseers stumbled across the fields, their authority fractured, voices trembling as they searched for the slaves who had vanished into the river. The cotton swayed in the wind as if mocking their panic, and even the birds seemed to sense the disruption of order. Mr. Thompson, the master, stood on the porch of his mansion, his face pale, his hands trembling as he tried to comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred. Word spread quickly among the remaining enslaved workers. Some huddled in corners, whispering in fear, while others stared toward the river, awe and terror etched on their faces. For the first time, they had witnessed true defiance, a courage so absolute that even the fearsome master had been rendered powerless. Chike's leadership and the unity of the Igbo group had turned the tables in a single, irrevocable act. The overseers attempted to reassert control, shouting orders and brandishing whips, but the impact of the event lingered too strongly in the air. Authority that had once been absolute was now fractured, undermined not by force but by the unwavering resolve of those they sought to dominate. The plantation workers had seen that even chains could not bind the spirit when courage and unity dictated action. Across the neighboring estates, rumors began to circulate, whispered cautiously among other enslaved communities, and even reaching the ears of sympathetic outsiders. The story of the Igbo slaves' defiance, their refusal to be property, their collective step into the river was passed along in hushed tones, carrying with it both inspiration and fear. Masters who heard it were unsettled. The legend suggested that the seemingly unassailable power of a plantation could be undone by those it oppressed. Meanwhile, the few who had survived on the margins, or had witnessed from a distance, carried the story forward, ensuring that the act of rebellion would not fade into obscurity. The courage displayed by Chike and the others became a beacon, a symbol that dignity and autonomy could outshine the harshest cruelty. Even in the aftermath of fear and potential reprisal, the seeds of resistance had been firmly planted in the minds and hearts of the enslaved community. For Mr. Thompson, the humiliation was profound. His authority had been publicly undermined, his control over his property exposed as fragile. The river, a natural boundary he had long considered inconsequential, had become a stage for defiance that he could neither punish nor erase. His attempts to assert dominance only highlighted the irreversibility of what had transpired. The slaves had chosen freedom, even at the cost of their lives. Chike, though gone from the plantation, remained a figure of awe and respect. His courage and leadership became legend among those who survived, inspiring whispers of hope, stories of defiance, and the enduring message that human dignity could never be entirely stripped, even in the harshest oppression. By the end of the day, the Darnell plantation had been transformed, not physically, but spiritually. The river had claimed the bodies of those who refused to submit, but it had also carried forward a powerful testament. Oppression could never fully contain the human spirit, and even in chains, courage could illuminate the path to freedom. The Darnell plantation remained, its fields stretching endlessly under the hot Georgian sun. But the air had changed. The whispers of that fateful day lingered like a shadow over the cotton rows and the grand mansion. Mr. Thompson moved among the remaining enslaved workers with a forced sternness. Yet each glance toward the river reminded him of his failure to control the hearts and spirits of those he deemed property. Authority, once absolute, now seemed fragile and hollow. Far from the riverbank, those who had witnessed or survived the act carried its story into neighboring plantations and enslaved communities. Chike's leadership and the unity of the Igbo slaves became a legend, whispered in secret gatherings, sung in muted songs, and taught to the young as a symbol of unyielding defiance. It was more than a tale of rebellion. It was a lesson that dignity, identity, and the courage to choose one's fate could never be fully suppressed. The act itself, walking into the water rather than continue as tools of labor, was terrifying and irreversible, yet it transformed fear into reverence. The plantation had lost more than labor that day. It had lost the illusion of total control. Overseers and masters alike learned that tyranny could be resisted in ways that were both silent and profound, and that even the most oppressive systems could be challenged when people chose honor over survival. Within the surviving Igbo community, the story became a moral compass. Children learned that courage sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice, that freedom was a value worth defending at all costs, and that unity could magnify the power of resistance. Chike, though his fate beyond the river remained unknown to some, was immortalized in memory as a figure of strategy, resolve, and unbroken spirit. The river itself became sacred in memory, a symbol of both peril and liberation. It carried the bodies of those who refused subjugation, and it carried the story forward, an enduring testament to the human spirit that refused to be owned, that refused to bow, and that refused to abandon its identity even when chained. For generations, the tale persisted in whispers, a forbidden legend of the Igbo slaves who walked into the water rather than serve, a story both tragic and triumphant. It reminded those who heard it that freedom was not simply the absence of chains, but the presence of choice, dignity, and courage. And though the Darnell plantation continued to function under the weight of its master's authority, the memory of that day haunted every field, every cotton row, and every mansion hall. The legend of the Igbo slaves endured, a quiet but relentless proof that even in the darkest oppression, the human spirit could rise, unbroken, unbowed, and gloriously free.